Mortars are probably fairly underrated for the factions that can take them, which is what, really just Vampire Coast and the Empire, but against Elves specifically, they are quite good for a number of reasons. Elves tend to have lower HP. They also tend to have lighter formation, not so much in Ryder Rohan's build as he faces off once again against Calamity. High Elves versus Vampire Coast, and Silustra's leading the way with a huge gunline build. I say gunline, it's actually quad mortars plus 3 handguns, one of which is the black spot. And we've got some gun Promethean mobs as well, so a pretty sturdy gunline. Looks like a couple of bombers currently getting beat down by Shadow Walkers as they outrange them significantly. Rangers and Silver Helms back up the Shadow Walkers, 4 of them. A couple of Rangers here. Looks like maybe 3 Rangers, 4 Rangers, and then mix of Reavers and Silver Helms. Lots of each, and an Archmage of Metal here. Looking for some Plague of Rust and Searing Doom. You see the Silustra summon early here. Rotting Prometheans being brought up. He's got that plus some Spiteful Shot, Tide Call, and of course, the Ghosts. But yeah, the Bombers, you can see their range is a little bit of a liability in this matchup as they get significantly outranged and DPS down. That said, the Mortars will apply consistent pressure at range in order to, keep the High Elves from just being able to sit back and dominate with their archers, right? Oftentimes, matchups with the Vampire Coast are sort of dictated by those mid-range engagements, whether that be Dark Elves historically having a hard time in this matchup because Dark Shards get outranged by handguns, right? And just in general, the Dark Elves, although they have great DPS, their mid-range units are relatively limited in their range, right? Their crossbows easily get outranged by a lot of units in the game, honestly, but the High Elves don't have that problem so much, right? Their archers definitely have the range to try and outcompete here. But the Mortars definitely equalize that equation, and definitely in my experience with the Empire can be very good, especially if you think your opponent is going to go more archer focused, which often happens more against Vampire Coast than it does against the Empire because zombies are quite slow and vulnerable to getting shot to bits by archers, especially very accurate long-range high elf archers who can put a lot of DPS in for their cost. But here, the Silver Helms trying to penetrate these lines here. If we take a nice wide view, so far all 3 Prometheans sitting pretty, guarding the Mortars right now as the High Elves just attack in the front line. We do see the Damned Knights Errant being brought up. It's going to be a little bit of a problem from a terror perspective, and although Rangers don't have loose formation, once they engage in melee, of course, they will be nice and clumped up, so one mortar shot can kind of ruin the unit, to be honest, once they're engaged in melee. Although they're going to obviously outtrade zombies here, no problem. Let's see, the Mortars right now, very smart positioning and targeting here. Definitely going after the Shadow Walkers. We've got some bats here as well to try and rein in, maybe interrupt there. But speaking of interrupt, yeah, the Reavers get through. Some of the Prometheans get caught out of position, kind of moving into the front line. That opens up right over Rohan to charge down some of these Mortars, get them shut down. But from the Vampire Coast perspective, this is why you take 4 of them, right? Is because 2 of them are shut down, but you can then immediately collapse with the Prometheans, try and turn the guns here, the handguns that are remaining, turn and fire, and just get as much DPS on these light, relatively squishy Elven cavalry. And by pushing them away, therefore secure the other mortar that's still remaining. This mortar crew also manages to extricate itself without crumbling too much and can get back on their guns, continue firing. And this presents a pretty huge issue for the High Elves, right? The frontline engagement was more or less a wash, which from the value perspective favors the Vampire Coast because their frontline's a lot cheaper. But now the Shadow Walkers are in a little bit of a tricky position here. We've got another Rotting Promethean being summoned up. And the Prometheans, the Bombers, both the summons here, all this stuff is eating ammunition from the Shadow Walkers that they're definitely going to need to take out these late game targets. In particular, the Rotting Prometheans are going to be quite formidable with their armor. And there's not a lot of melee prowess left for Ryder Rohan as he is struggling to penetrate the gun lines here. Yeah, we see the targeting of the mortars now, continuing to kind of cycle through the Shadow Walkers. The Shadow Walkers don't take a crazy amount of damage. Like I said, that loose formation definitely helps. It's not like the mortars are particularly accurate, but it's more so just about applying consistent pressure. The High Elves and forcing them into engagements where they're kind of lower HP, more like attack defense focused units are going to struggle, right? If you can hit them with a lot of different stuff. Top tier analysis, I know, but yeah, you can see just all the healthy guns here. The Prometheans, even as they're maneuvering and fighting, obviously are going to be getting shots. These shotgun bombers, which are the riders rather, which you know, they do a pretty good amount of damage. Definitely solid damage. I mean, it's nothing crazy, but just the fact that you get that little bonus, right? Again, as they're maneuvering around, you can see, we look at the health bars, especially like the units over here as an example. Yeah, it's looking pretty rough, but Silustra potentially also in a tricky position here. Doesn't want to get killed too badly. A nice Plague of Rust here, Overcast. Does drop the Prometheans down significantly. That allows the Shadow Walkers to shoot very effectively, bypassing that armor. And let's see, this unit might actually get sniped here as they kind of outrun the range of the mortars here. Rider Rohan's able to pull many units way out of position. Let's see if he can capitalize right now. I mean, yeah, those are rotting Prometheans. The thing is, he can even take this one unit out, but the other two are counting so much on the balance of power. Of course, the Shadow Walkers are having to expend ammunition this whole time as well. Shadow Walkers are also throwing some shots at Silustra, which I think, honestly, might be a little bit of a mistake here. Maybe just save the ammunition. But the mage here, Archmage, surprisingly doesn't have magic damage. I thought most wizards pretty much did have magic damage in melee. Kind of surprising to me. But nonetheless, had she had magic damage there, she probably would have actually just killed Silustra outright in that engagement. Instead, yeah, just all the arrows being eaten by Silustra here, which from a value perspective, really need those to go into the Prometheans and army losses cascades, as the mortars are still there. So, yeah, the gun line carries the day. Undead gun line from Calamity. Nice to see it. Vampire Coast, relatively underplayed faction these days. But this is definitely a way you can play them, and certainly, like, the handguns all pay for themselves. They get plenty of protection, and then the mortars. Technically, only one pays for itself, but again, this is why you bring so many, right? To apply consistent pressure. Even if a few of them pay for themselves, that's great. Which you definitely would expect, or at least hope, one or two of them to pay for themselves if you bring this many. But, yeah, then the rest of the build here, kind of just in support of them. Silustra also pretty solid DPS herself. 11,000 damage dealt, 1,500 gold value. Not too bad. Yeah. Overall, Rider of Rohan just kind of struggled to get into those guns effectively. Shadow Walkers, decent value, but still don't quite pay for themselves. Rangers, some of them get impressive kill numbers, but from a value perspective, they got out-traded pretty hard there. But, I mean, what are you supposed to do, really? Maybe just trade out the Rangers for all archers, all archers, and just kind of try and pick the Vampire Coast apart that way and not really engage in melee as much as possible. I don't know. Certainly easier said than done. Maybe some bolt throwers, although one thing is that mortars are relatively low profile. They're pretty wide as far as artillery models go, but not super easy to trade out with something like a bolt thrower. Yeah, the mortars, they also don't trade very well back, but it's hard to say if that's a very cost-effective trade on either side. Mortars would probably more likely just fire down on the archers while taking the shots from the eagle claws. But anyway, certainly an interesting matchup, and if we kind of think through, yeah, other factions that are potential mortar bait, I will say. Bertonia, obviously, their cavalry is quite scary, and a lot of people probably wouldn't pick this matchup. There's other things to worry about, but you do think, for whatever reason, your opponent might try and take like a horde of peasants and archers. A mortar or two or more can potentially save you in that aspect. Yeah, generally, I would say that I mean, you have relatively cheap halberds. It's actually interesting, the comparison. This is totally sidetracking, but yeah, we don't see either of these units in this battle. But yeah, the halberds are relatively close. Even though, obviously, living halberds have much better stats all the way around, but just in terms of cost, right? The deckhands have 40 more unit models and significantly more HP, so definitely more of a tar pit unit, but interesting to note that just in general, I would say the Vampire Coast has pretty good anti-large, so again, not a super common matchup, but other factions with kind of like light archers, even Empire, this is an interesting matchup you don't see super often again, but I would think that given that the Empire skirmishers are largely tight formation, other than like Huntsmen, which actually are pretty good in this matchup, and I would probably take them because of loose formation and a bunch of other reasons. But yeah, the Mortars could potentially be dangerous against Empire. There's not a ton of other factions, honestly, that I would really advocate. Maybe Tomb Kings. I don't know. I really haven't played this matchup in a long time because I try and avoid undead versus undead as much as possible. But theoretically here, we've got a lot of lighter, basically no armor, right? So any of these infantry targets are going to be good for the Mortars to shoot at, especially like more expensive the better. But I don't know. Do people even take Tomb Guard in that matchup? Do people take Tomb Kings at all, or do you even have to worry about their infantry, really? I don't think so. Like, when I think through from a Vampire Coast perspective, nothing here is really particularly threatening, except maybe mass skeleton archers, so Mortar might help in that aspect. But anyway, that's it for today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you like this sort of content, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell notification button. Every time I upload a new video, you'll be notified. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.